Hi, I'm Gary Baddeley, President of the Disinformation Company, known to some of you as the publisher of books and films featuring some of the authors here at this International Conference on Ancient Studies in Dubai. In 2008, I attended the inaugural International Conference on Ancient Studies, which featured some amazing speakers talking about the mysteries of ancient civilizations, including some with whom I'd worked professionally, such as Robert Bauval and John Major Jenkins. One of the most fascinating presentations was made by Boston University geologist Robert Schoch, whom I had met previously, but this was the first time we had had an opportunity to discuss our professional interests directly. A little over a year later, Robert and I mounted a short but action-packed expedition to Easter Island, known locally as Rapa Nui, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This film is a brief introduction to our findings. It was not filmed or produced professionally, but we hope it will give you a sense of how excited we were by what we found.
The huge stone heads at Easter Island are emblematic of ancient mysteries. I've spent much of my career as a geologist looking at ancient megalithic monumental structures around the world, perhaps most famously the Great Sphinx in Egypt. And as part of what I've been looking at and tying in with the general theme of my research, I really wanted to see the ancient statues, the moai, these huge heads and torsos on Easter Island. Absolutely fascinating to me as I studied the statues on the island were the varying degrees of erosion and the varying degrees to which they were buried in natural sediment. Not all of them are eroded to the same extent, not all are buried to the same extent in natural sediment. And I start asking myself, well, what kind of geological processes are going on here? Is it consistent throughout the island? Are there different geological processes in parts of the island versus other parts? And could we start to study these systematically to try to get a good feel, a good handle on the varying dates of different moai? I became convinced that not all of them were carved at approximately the same time, that there's probably a large stretch of time between the earliest and the latest moai, and I think this is a type of issue that could be addressed systematically by further detailed geological research.
Robert and I were lucky enough to be introduced to not one, but two former governors of Easter Island, and through them we were able to meet and hear some of the Rapa Nui mythology and oral history that hints at some alternative explanations of the moai.
The native Easter Islanders, known as the Rapa Nui people, have a rich store of oral legends, traditions, history, mythology, and many conventional archaeologists, they may listen to it, but for the most part they dismiss such oral and traditional mythologies and religions. I actually find in my research that's very important to not take everything literally, but on the other hand not to dismiss it, to really listen intently, read, and see if there might be some kind of factual basis to some of these oral traditions and mythologies.
Robert had spent some time before we arrived on the island researching the legend of the giants, and found an account in the National Museum report for 1889 in the Smithsonian Archives recounting the experiences of the island's first recorded European visitor, the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen, who encountered it on Easter Sunday, 1722. One of his crew, Behrens, described the men as averaging 12 feet high, so we were very interested in learning more from the modern-day Rapa Nui.
I believe that we should at least consider the accounts of the early explorers, the early discoverers of Easter Island. So, for instance, in the 18th century, among the earliest explorers of Easter Island discussed such things as so-called giants. They discussed meeting people that were 12 feet tall. At least the males were 12 feet tall, the women were 10 feet tall. Now, are these just tall tales, literally, or was there maybe some truth to it? Was there perhaps a relic population that was fairly large, even so-called giants on the island? I can't say that for certain there were because we don't yet have physical evidence of such a thing, but is that a possibility? I don't think we should dismiss it outright. For instance, just recently, little hobbits, so-called hobbits, very small skeletons of a distinct species of humanoid, has been found in Indonesia, and sure enough, the Dutch in the 18th century had described stories of very small people inhabiting the islands, and maybe now we have physical evidence for them. According to the earliest recorded native Easter Island traditions, the island was actually populated not by one group of people, but initially by two groups of settlers. These are sometimes referred to as the long ears and the short ears. And according to the early traditions, the long ears first arrived at the island. It was the long ears who actually started the monumental stone sculptures, that they built the moai and initiated that entire practice. According to some traditions, the long ears were distinguished by their long extended earlobes. According to one interpretation, they may have been actually bigger and larger overall, perhaps even, quote, giants, unquote.
Another fascinating part of the local mythology involves the use of mana to move the giant moai.
The Easter Island moai are absolutely magnificent. They're huge, carved structures. They're carved out of solid rock. The largest erected moai are about 10 meters or 33 feet tall. They've been estimated, the large ones, to weigh up to 75 tons or more. And how the Easter Islanders did this is absolutely startling and enigmatic. They even had bigger plans, actually. In the quarry, you can observe an unfinished moai, and that unfinished moai is on the order of 21 meters long, about 69 feet, and estimated to weigh over 250 tons. How they erected these, how they carved them, is still a mystery. If you ask the native Easter Islanders how it was done, as Europeans have asked for the last 200 plus years, they don't give you a, quote, rational Western explanation. They say it was done by mana, that the statues walked to their locations, or that it was simply mana. And what they mean by that is sort of a supernatural or spiritual, or we might call psychic force, that moved, somehow transported the statues. So this is not very satisfying to the Western imagination, to the Western mind perhaps, and to conventional archaeologists, and they simply dismiss the concept of mana as, nonsense, religious nonsense. But I have to wonder, does it mask something else, something that we don't know?
Another mystery relates to the few moai that are carved from basalt.
The vast majority of moai were carved from volcanic tuffs, a relatively soft, all other things considered, volcanic rock. A few of the moai, however, are carved from basalt, a much harder material, much more difficult to work, but it lasts much longer. Now, when it comes to the moai carved out of the volcanic tuffs, we saw the quarry. We explored it carefully, and it's very clear where the huge moai of volcanic tuff come from. But when it comes to the basaltic moai, which are much rarer on the island, it's not clear where they were quarried, where they were carved. I would expect geologically that, all other things being equal, basaltic quarries would be lower in the section, maybe along the coast, maybe even so far along the coast that they're now underwater. Now this would be very interesting if we found basalt quarries that are now under the water, because we know that water levels have risen over the last few thousand years since the end of the last ice age, and any flooded basalt quarries, that would suggest, if they're flooded, that they are extremely old.
Our team knew of earlier research by leading French explorer Jacques Cousteau that might lend support for Robert's speculative ideas about the underwater quarries.
Jacques Cousteau and his divers spent some time around Easter Island, and they are said to have found under the water some strange, very rectangular, what were described as rectangular holes or cavities in the basalt rocks. One thing that comes to my mind is whether they had actually discovered quarries under the ocean along the coast of Easter Island. So this is something I would very much like to explore. If in fact they discovered ancient quarries that are now buried by the sea, this would suggest that those quarries were incredibly old, that they were old enough that they have been inundated, they have been covered over by rising sea levels since the last ice age. And depending on how deep they are and what their geologic context is, we might be able to date them.
In such a short trip, it was inevitable that we would only begin to chip away at some of the mysteries of the island, leaving us all with a great sense of excitement at the prospect of a return trip.
As a geologist, I was fascinated by the volcanic structures on the island, in particular the caves on the island. There's lots of natural caves. I only had a short time to explore a couple of them, and I think these are worth looking at much more closely. It's known, according to the traditions, that the caves were used by people both to live in, to store goods, to perhaps bury the dead, and exploring the caves, looking at them very closely, I think could shed a lot more information on the origins and the history of Easter Island. Some of the little islands, the little islets they're called, off of the main island, they're tiny, smaller than an acre perhaps, but they have natural caves on them. One of those little islets we got to very briefly. I was able to explore for about 10 minutes. I found some caves, but I could not get into them. I just didn't have the time. So it's these types of things I would like to be able to go back and look at much more definitively.
What Robert didn't mention was that visiting the islet was not easy. That's me in the orange hat, holding onto Robert's arms as he dangles in the water. The good news is that he did get onto the islet with no damage, and what he found left us eager to return.
On a return trip to Easter Island, I would really like to be able to look for what I'll call the missing basalt quarries. There are some moai that are carved out of basalt, but no one seems to really know where the quarries for this basalt are. This is not insignificant. Perhaps, and there's some suggestions to this effect, perhaps those basalt quarries are along the coast, but now flooded, now underwater, under the sea level. And if so, this suggests that maybe they're much older. So looking for those missing basalt quarries, which would involve some diving, and I know how to dive, this is something I would very much like to do on a return trip to Easter Island.
There is far more to what we found as we explored the remote and inaccessible corners of Rapa Nui. But before these can responsibly be announced to the public, we do need to verify our findings and make sure that all possible explanations and assumptions have been examined. We very much hope to obtain funding to return to pursue these and other fascinating findings on Rapa Nui. One last thing that I should reveal now was that we witnessed the first wedding of 2010 on Easter Island. And it was the marriage of our very own Robert Schoch and his fiancée, Katie Ulysses.